Imagine a boy born into poverty. No wealth. No powerful family name. No university degree. Yet one day, his face would appear on the most famous bill in America. He would challenge kings. Capture lightning from the sky. Charm Europe's elite. And help build an entirely new nation. But here's the part no one talks about. Before he became famous, he was beaten. Before he became respected, he was humiliated. Before he became powerful, he ran away with almost nothing. This is the real story of Benjamin Franklin. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy powerful true stories that reveal the hidden struggles behind greatness, make sure you subscribe, because the story you're about to hear changes the way you see success forever. And as you watch, ask yourself one question. Would you have survived his beginning? Before he flew a kite into a thunderstorm. Before kings invited him into royal chambers. Before his face was printed on the most powerful currency in the New World. He was just a boy in a house that smelled like boiling animal fat. And if you had walked through Boston in 1706, you would never have noticed him. Welcome to the channel. Tonight, we are not telling the polished legend of a founding father. We are telling the real story, the uncomfortable, uncertain, fragile beginning of Benjamin Franklin. If you enjoy deep, cinematic true stories that reveal how ordinary beginnings turn into extraordinary lives, make sure you subscribe. Because what you're about to hear might change the way you see success forever. Now imagine this. Boston, early 18th century. Not the city of brick buildings and universities. Not the tourist destination. It was mud. Wooden houses leaned into narrow dirt roads that froze hard in winter and collapsed into thick sludge in spring. Livestock wandered freely. Smoke hung constantly in the air from hundreds of chimneys burning wood and coal. Life was disciplined. Religion shaped everything. Sundays were silent. Work stopped. Laughter could be judged excessive. Children were raised with the constant awareness that God watched their thoughts as carefully as their actions. In that world, on January 17, 1706, Benjamin Franklin was born. He was not born into influence. He was not born into wealth. He was the 15th child of a candlemaker. 15. Pause there for a moment. 15 children meant crowded beds. Shared clothing. Meals stretched thin. No private space. No excess. His father, Josiah Franklin, made candles from tallow, animal fat rendered in large iron kettles. The smell filled their home constantly. It clung to clothing. It seeped into wood beams. It followed the family everywhere. Benjamin grew up breathing that smell. And from the very beginning, life was practical. Every child in that house would eventually contribute labor. Childhood was short. Responsibility came early. Yet inside that modest, overcrowded home, something unusual existed. Conversation. Josiah was not a wealthy man, but he was thoughtful. At dinner, he invited neighbors, ministers, tradesmen. They debated theology. They argued about politics. They discussed moral responsibility. Young Benjamin listened. He rarely interrupted. But he absorbed everything. He noticed how arguments were constructed. How tone could persuade. How language shaped authority. In many homes, children were expected to remain silent. In this home, ideas were alive. His mother, Abia, was literate, uncommon for a woman of her class. She encouraged reading. She valued knowledge. She made sure her children learned letters early. Books were expensive luxuries. But somehow, despite financial strain, the Franklin home contained them. Religious texts. Sermons. And something else, biographies of ancient Greeks and Romans. Stories of men who shaped republics. Men who rose from humble beginnings to command nations. Those stories mattered. Because Benjamin did not see himself surrounded by wealth. He saw himself surrounded by limitations. And those ancient biographies whispered a dangerous idea into his imagination. Origin does not determine destiny. At 8 years old, Benjamin was enrolled in the Boston Latin School. It was rigorous. Focused on classical languages. Designed to prepare boys for Harvard and ministry. He excelled quickly. Teachers noticed his speed. His memory. His curiosity. It seemed, briefly, that a new path might open. But education required money. And money required sacrifice. Josiah did the math. Lost labor from the shop. Fees. Future tuition. The decision came quietly. After less than 2 years, Benjamin's formal education ended. Forever. He was 10. Imagine being 10 years old and told that your schooling is finished, not because you failed, but because your family cannot afford your potential. Many would accept that as fate. Benjamin did not. He created a school inside himself. He borrowed books. Saved coins for second-hand copies. Read late into the night by candlelight. But here is what made him different. He did not read casually. He studied deliberately. If he admired an essay, he rewrote it from memory days later. Then he compared his version to the original. Where did his vocabulary fail? Where did his logic weaken? Where was his rhythm inferior? He treated writing like muscle training. He rewrote prose into poetry, then back into prose, forcing himself to expand his language control. He was engineering his own intellect. No teacher assigned this. No mentor required it. He chose it. Meanwhile, the candle shop awaited him. At 10, he entered full-time labor. Cutting wicks. Pouring molds. Carrying heavy supplies. Enduring the constant greasy heat. He hated it. Not because it was honest work. But because something inside him resisted permanence. He felt the weight of repetition. He felt the narrowing of possibility. He dreamed of the sea. Ships fascinated him. The harbor represented escape. But Josiah had already lost one son to the ocean. Benjamin would not be allowed that freedom. Instead, fate intervened differently. His older brother James returned from London with a printing press. Printing was powerful. It shaped opinion. It spread ideas. It moved conversations. At 12 years old, Benjamin was apprenticed to James. 9 years of service. Bound by contract. Obedience required. The work was intense. Hours standing at the case selecting individual letters. Setting type backward. Operating heavy presses. Cleaning ink from metal plates. But unlike candle making, printing fed his mind. Every pamphlet, every article, every debate passed through his hands. He read everything. He absorbed political arguments. Scientific observations. Satirical essays. He was no longer confined to the smell of tallow. He was surrounded by ideas. But apprenticeship meant hierarchy. James was master. Benjamin was subordinate. And tension grew quickly. Benjamin was talented, visibly so. He corrected errors. Improved phrasing. Offered suggestions. James did not always appreciate it. Talent without authority can threaten authority. When James launched a newspaper, Benjamin longed to contribute. James dismissed him. Too young. Too inexperienced. So Benjamin did something bold. He invented a character. A fictional widow named Silence Dogood. At night, he slipped essays under the print shop door. The letters were clever, observant, humorous, sharp. Boston readers loved them. They speculated about the mysterious author. Was it a minister? A scholar? A social elite? Never suspecting the teenage apprentice in the corner. When James discovered the truth, pride turned to anger. His younger brother had fooled him. Had outshined him. Punishments followed. Harsh words. Physical discipline. Control tightened. The relationship fractured. Benjamin learned a painful lesson. Intelligence alone does not protect you from authority. And at 17, after one beating too many, he made a decision that could have ruined his life. He ran. Running away as an apprentice was illegal. He could be arrested, blacklisted, ruined professionally. But staying felt smaller than risk. He sold books to finance passage. Boarded a small vessel. Left Boston behind without ceremony. The journey was harsh. Storms tossed the boat. Food was scarce. Clothes soaked through. When he arrived in Philadelphia, he was exhausted and nearly penniless. He walked into a bakery and bought bread. The baker misunderstood and handed him 3 large rolls. Benjamin tucked one under each arm and walked down the street eating the third. A young woman watched and laughed. Her name was Deborah Red. He did not know yet how intertwined their futures would become. But in that moment, he looked ridiculous. Disheveled. Hungry. Unknown. That was Benjamin Franklin at 17. Not a statesman. Not a scientist. Just a runaway with bread under his arms. But here is the truth about greatness. It rarely looks impressive at the beginning. Within days, he found work in another printing shop. Within weeks, his skill impressed employers. He worked harder than others. Read more than others. Improved faster than others. And soon, powerful people would begin to notice him. One of them would offer him an opportunity that seemed like destiny. An opportunity that would carry him across the Atlantic. An opportunity built on promises. And those promises would collapse. In the next part, you will see how trust nearly destroyed his ambition, and how betrayal in London forged the man who would later challenge an empire. Before we continue, ask yourself something honestly. If you were 17, beaten down, limited, legally bound, would you have had the courage to run? Or would you have stayed safe? Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there right now. Because somewhere tonight, another young person is deciding whether to accept limitation, or to step into uncertainty. And uncertainty is exactly where Benjamin Franklin is headed next. When Benjamin Franklin stepped onto the streets of Philadelphia at 17, he was free. Free from his brother. Free from contract. Free from humiliation. But freedom without stability is fragile. He needed work. He needed reputation. He needed something solid beneath his feet. And quickly, he proved something important: he was not just another runaway apprentice. He found employment in a printing shop almost immediately. His speed at setting type impressed older workers. His accuracy reduced costly errors. His discipline stood out in a trade where carelessness could ruin an entire page. He wasn't loud about his intelligence. He let his output speak. And people began talking. Not about his past. About his potential. Philadelphia was different from Boston. Less rigid. Less severe. More open. Different religious groups coexisted. Quakers, Anglicans, Presbyterians. The city felt less suffocating, less judgmental. For the first time, Benjamin experienced a community where ambition didn't immediately provoke suspicion. And then someone powerful took interest. Governor William Keith. To a young printer trying to establish himself, being noticed by the governor felt almost unreal. Keith praised him openly. "You are too talented to work for others," he told him. "You should have your own printing house." Imagine hearing that at 18. After years of being dismissed by an older brother. After years of physical discipline. After years of having your education cut short. Now a governor was telling you that you were exceptional. That you were meant for more. It is difficult to overstate how powerful that moment must have felt. Keith didn't stop at praise. He offered backing. Financial support. Letters of credit. Influence. All Benjamin had to do was travel to London to purchase proper printing equipment. The best presses. The finest type. He would return to Philadelphia not as an employee, but as a proprietor. Benjamin was careful by nature. But he was also young. And youth often mistakes validation for reliability. He wrote to his father seeking approval. Josiah was not impressed. Powerful men make promises easily, he warned. Money is harder to produce. But Benjamin had already felt something shift inside him. He was done waiting. He was done shrinking. He wanted momentum. And so in late 1724, at just 18 years old, Benjamin Franklin boarded a ship bound for London. He believed he was sailing toward independence. He did not yet know he was sailing toward his first true humiliation. The Atlantic crossing was long and uncomfortable. Weeks at sea meant cramped quarters, stale air, unpredictable weather. Storms battered the vessel. Waves rose like walls. Nights were endless and uncertain. Benjamin spent much of that time thinking about his future. About Deborah Red, whom he had begun courting before leaving. About the shop he would soon own. He imagined writing his name above a door. He imagined being respected. He imagined never again being subject to someone else's temper. When the ship neared England, he asked the captain about the letters of credit the governor had promised. The captain seemed puzzled. The mailbag was brought forward. Letters sorted. Names checked. Benjamin searched carefully. Nothing. No letters. No funds. No backing. No explanation. The governor had sent him across an ocean with nothing but words. No safety. No capital. No arrangement. Just promises. The realization must have been suffocating. He was 18. In one of the largest cities in the world. Without support. Many people would have panicked. Some would have blamed fate. Some would have written bitter letters. Benjamin did something different. He found work immediately. London in 1724 was overwhelming. Nearly 600,000 people crowded into narrow streets thick with smoke and noise. The River Thames was packed with ships from across the globe. Merchants shouted. Carriages rattled over stone. Vendors hawked food. Beggars reached into passing crowds. For a colonial boy from Boston and Philadelphia, it felt like stepping into the heart of an empire. And he noticed something. Hierarchy. In London, class was almost immovable. Birth determined position. Aristocrats lived in another world entirely. Tradesmen worked hard but rarely rose beyond their assigned rank. Social mobility was narrow. In America, class lines existed, but they were softer. In London, they were carved into stone. Benjamin observed this carefully. Because observation was his instinct. He secured employment at a respected printing house. And within weeks, something became clear. The American apprentice was outperforming seasoned London journeymen. He worked longer hours. He avoided alcohol during shifts, drinking water instead of beer, despite ridicule. They called him the Water American. But at the end of the day, his pages were cleaner. His lines straighter. His work more precise. Mockery faded into reluctant respect. He lived frugally. Rented modest lodging. Ate simple meals. Saved money. Spent spare coins on books. And here, something important happened. London exposed him to intellectual life on a scale he had never experienced. Coffeehouses served as informal universities. For the price of a drink, he could sit for hours listening to debates about politics, philosophy, science. He listened. Rarely interrupting. Absorbing arguments. Testing ideas internally. He wrote. He experimented with philosophical essays. At one point, he published a small pamphlet exploring questions of free will and morality. Later in life, he would view some of its conclusions as naive. But even that taught him something. Ideas have weight. Publication carries responsibility. And youth sometimes confuses cleverness with wisdom. He also learned about loneliness. At first, he wrote Deborah regularly. Describing London. Assuring her of his intentions. But distance erodes certainty. Weeks turned into months. Responses slowed. Silence followed. He felt the quiet consequences of ambition. Leaving creates space. And space changes things. London offered temptations. Theaters. Taverns. Pleasure gardens. He tasted some of it. But indulgence did not satisfy him long. He noticed something about men who lived for pleasure. They did not build. They stagnated. Benjamin wanted ascent. He studied the press trade in London carefully. Observed improvements in machinery. Improved his technique. Learned standards far above colonial printing. He was no longer just trying to escape limitation. He was gathering leverage. And during this time, something hardened inside him. He stopped expecting rescue. He stopped believing in promises without proof. He began relying only on skill. After nearly 2 years, he made a decision. London would not be his future. In England, he would always be a tradesman. In America, he could become more. He secured passage home in 1726. The return voyage was rough. Storms delayed them. Supplies ran thin. Weeks stretched long. But he did not return as a boy who had been fooled. He returned as a man who had recalibrated. He wrote reflections during the journey. Outlined principles for himself. Industry. Frugality. Sincerity. Self-control. Reputation over impulse. He began designing a system for his own character. Not casually. Deliberately. When he stepped back onto Philadelphia soil at age 20, he had no wealth to show for London. But he had something more powerful. Perspective. He had seen empire. He had seen class rigidity. He had seen false promises from authority. He had learned that independence must be engineered. Not gifted. Philadelphia felt smaller now. But it felt possible. He returned to work. He returned to relationships. He discovered Deborah had married, to a man who proved unreliable. Life had moved without him. Some opportunities do not wait. He felt regret, but not paralysis. Because now he understood something fundamental. The world does not reward emotion. It rewards preparation. And he was preparing. In the next phase of his life, he would create alliances. Form intellectual circles. Launch publications. Build influence slowly, strategically. He would no longer chase opportunity. He would manufacture it. But the transformation from skilled printer to respected public figure would require something far more demanding than talent. It would require discipline at a level few men attempt. And in the next part, you will see how Benjamin Franklin began systematically engineering his own character, through a list of 13 virtues that would shape everything that followed. Before we continue, ask yourself something honestly. If you were betrayed at 18 in a foreign city, would you have returned bitter? Or better? Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. Because somewhere tonight, someone is facing disappointment. And what they do next will define them. Benjamin Franklin chose to become sharper. And what he builds next will change everything. When Benjamin Franklin returned to Philadelphia at 20 years old, he was not wealthy. He did not return with equipment. He did not return with investors. He did not return with the grand success Governor Keith had promised. But he returned with something far more powerful. Clarity. London had stripped away illusions. No one was coming to rescue him. No powerful man would carry him upward. No shortcut would substitute for structure. If he wanted influence, he would have to construct it piece by piece. And so he began with something most people ignore. Himself. He resumed work in printing, first temporarily under others. But his mindset had shifted. He no longer saw himself as merely a worker earning wages. He saw printing as leverage. He observed which contracts were profitable. Which publications gained attention. Which ideas spread fastest. He paid attention not only to words, but to systems. And slowly, deliberately, he began positioning himself not just as a printer, but as a thinker. At 21, he gathered a small group of ambitious young tradesmen and artisans in Philadelphia. They were not aristocrats. They were not scholars with degrees. They were mechanics, merchants, craftsmen. But they were curious. They met on Friday evenings. They asked questions. Not small talk. Real questions. Is lying ever justified? What makes a society stable? How should wealth be used? What improves a community? They called themselves the Junto. It was not glamorous. There were no candles in grand halls. No silk jackets. Just wooden tables. Ink-stained hands. Earnest debate. But what Benjamin was building was subtle and brilliant. He was constructing a network. A network of disciplined minds who trusted one another. They shared books. Shared business opportunities. Shared ideas for civic improvement. This was more than discussion. It was strategic community building. And in those evenings, something essential happened. Benjamin refined his thinking out loud. He practiced persuasion. He practiced listening. He practiced moderation. He was training not just his intellect, but his presence. Because influence is rarely built in isolation. It is built in rooms. Rooms like that. But even as his external world expanded, he understood something uncomfortable. Talent is unreliable without discipline. So he created a system. A framework for engineering his own character. He wrote down 13 virtues. Temperance. Silence. Order. Resolution. Frugality. Industry. Sincerity. Justice. Moderation. Cleanliness. Tranquility. Chastity. Humility. Not abstract ideals. Operational goals. He created a small notebook. Each page devoted to one virtue. Each day divided into columns. And every evening, he marked where he failed. A black dot for each lapse. It was ruthless. There was no excuse column. No emotional justification. Only self-measurement. He did not attempt to master all 13 at once. He focused on one at a time. Until the page showed minimal failure. Then he moved to the next. This was not religious ritual. It was behavioral engineering. He was constructing reliability. And he admitted something humbling later in life. The virtue he struggled with most was order. Despite his systems, his desk often fell into disarray. His papers scattered. He could master grand ideas, but small details frustrated him. That honesty mattered. Because what he was building was not perfection. It was awareness. And awareness creates control. Meanwhile, his printing business began to expand. In 1728, he entered partnership to open his own shop. The risk was enormous. Debt. Responsibility. Reputation on the line. But this time, he did not depend on promises. He calculated. He planned. He leveraged connections from the junto. He worked relentlessly. He woke early. Often before dawn. Planned his day intentionally. Worked long hours at the press. Delivered paper personally in wheelbarrows to demonstrate industry. He made sure the city saw him working. Not boasting. Working. Reputation spreads faster when witnessed. And within a short time, something happened. Government contracts came. Steady income. Authority began trusting him. And here is where something crucial shifted. He was no longer simply surviving. He was accumulating credibility. In 1729, he acquired a struggling newspaper. Most would have seen risk. Benjamin saw opportunity. He transformed it. Made it lively. Readable. Engaging. He mixed practical advice with wit. He understood something essential. People don't just consume information. They consume personality. And he had one. His newspaper grew. His influence widened. Then came something even more impactful. In 1732, he launched what would become iconic. Poor Richard's Almanac. Written under the name Richard Saunders. It was clever. Memorable. Full of practical wisdom wrapped in humor. A penny saved is a penny earned. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. These sayings were simple. But simplicity travels. The almanac sold in massive numbers for the time. Year after year. It made him financially stable. But more importantly, it made him culturally embedded. His words entered homes. His phrases entered memory. He had moved from tradesman to voice. But here is what makes this phase extraordinary. He did not allow success to soften discipline. He continued tracking his virtues. Continued refining his habits. Continued limiting indulgence. Because he understood something most people miss. Early success is fragile. Many people reach their first plateau, and stop climbing. Benjamin did not. He began asking new questions. Practical questions. Why do chimneys smoke poorly? Why are some rooms warmer than others? Why does static electricity behave the way it does? His curiosity expanded beyond printing. Toward science. But not science for prestige. Science for utility. He designed improvements to fireplaces, creating a more efficient heating system later known as the Franklin stove. It consumed less wood. Produced more warmth. Reduced smoke. The governor offered him a patent. He declined. He believed inventions should benefit society broadly. This was strategic generosity. It elevated his reputation beyond commerce. He was becoming something rare. A businessman trusted for character. A thinker trusted for practicality. A citizen trusted for contribution. He founded a lending library. Helped establish a fire department. Promoted civic improvements. Each action increased his influence. Without arrogance. Without spectacle. Because by now, he understood power. True power accumulates quietly. But even as his reputation grew in Philadelphia, something larger was forming in his mind. He had seen London. He had observed empire. He had studied systems of governance. And slowly, almost invisibly, his interests were shifting. From individual improvement to societal structure. From personal discipline to public impact. And the next phase of his life would push him into an arena far larger than printing presses and almanacs. It would push him toward electricity. Toward international recognition. Toward political influence. But before that, he would perform an experiment that could have killed him. And in doing so, he would transform from respected printer into global intellectual figure. Before we move forward, ask yourself something. How many people do you know who track their own behavior daily? Who deliberately build character instead of reacting emotionally? Franklin's genius was not lightning. It was structure. And structure was about to propel him into history. In the next part, you will see how curiosity led him to chase storms. And how one dangerous experiment made Europe call him brilliant. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. Because somewhere tonight, someone is building discipline. And discipline is the foundation of everything that follows. By the time Benjamin Franklin reached his mid-30s, he had achieved something rare. He was financially stable. Respected in Philadelphia. Owner of a successful printing business. Publisher of a widely read newspaper. Creator of Poor Richard's Almanac. Founder of civic institutions. He could have stopped there. Many men would have. Comfort has a way of convincing you that growth is no longer necessary. But Franklin was not built for comfort alone. He was built for curiosity. And curiosity is restless. He began noticing something that fascinated educated circles across Europe. Electricity. In the 1740s, electricity was mysterious, a spectacle more than a science. Traveling demonstrators would generate sparks using glass tubes and static machines, shocking volunteers for entertainment. People laughed. Clapped. Called it magic. Franklin did not see magic. He saw a pattern. He read everything he could find about electrical experiments happening in Europe. Letters from scientists. Descriptions of sparks jumping between metal objects. The strange way certain materials attracted dust after being rubbed. He began performing experiments himself. Simple at first. Rubbing glass rods with cloth. Observing sparks. Noticing that electricity behaved differently depending on materials. But what set Franklin apart was not just experimentation. It was interpretation. He believed electricity was not multiple forces, as many European thinkers argued, but one single fluid. He proposed that objects were either positively or negatively charged depending on excess or deficiency of this fluid. Today that sounds obvious. At the time, it was revolutionary. He coined terms still used today. Positive. Negative. Battery. Charge. He was not merely observing electricity. He was naming it. And naming creates structure. His letters describing these ideas were sent to Europe and read before scientific societies. Scholars were stunned. A colonial printer, without formal scientific training, was proposing a coherent theory of electricity. His reputation crossed the Atlantic. But then came the question that would define his scientific legacy. Was lightning electrical? At the time, lightning was viewed primarily as divine force. Punishment from God. Uncontrollable. Untouchable. Franklin saw resemblance. The crackle of static sparks. The flash of lightning. The smell in the air after a storm. He hypothesized that lightning was a massive electrical discharge. And if that were true, it could be controlled. That idea alone was radical. To suggest that lightning, the sky's fury, could be understood by human reasoning was almost defiant. So he designed an experiment. Contrary to popular myth, Franklin's first proposal did not involve a kite. He initially suggested placing a metal rod atop a tall tower to draw electricity from clouds. But no such tower was readily available in Philadelphia. So he improvised. A kite. Made of silk to resist rain. With a metal key attached to the string. And a silk ribbon near the bottom to insulate his hand. In 1752, during a thunderstorm, he and his son William launched the kite. The sky darkened. Rain fell. Clouds roared overhead. The string became wet. The fibers began conducting electricity. Franklin moved his hand near the key. And he saw it. A spark. Tiny. But unmistakable. Lightning and electricity were the same phenomenon. He had not been struck by lightning, contrary to legend. That would have killed him. Instead, he captured ambient electrical charge from the storm clouds. Enough to prove his theory. The implications were enormous. If lightning was electrical, buildings could be protected. And so he invented the lightning rod. A simple metal rod placed atop structures, connected by wire to the ground. It redirected electrical discharge safely into the earth. Churches adopted it. Homes adopted it. Cities adopted it. And something fascinating happened. Some clergy resisted. If lightning was divine punishment, was preventing it interfering with God's will? Franklin did not argue theology. He demonstrated results. Fewer fires. Fewer destroyed buildings. Practical benefits silenced many critics. Europe took notice. Scientific societies honored him. The Royal Society in London awarded him its prestigious Copley Medal. Universities, despite his lack of formal education, granted him honorary degrees. He became Dr. Franklin. The runaway apprentice who never finished school was now internationally recognized as a scientist. Pause there. Consider that arc. A boy pulled from school at 10. Now celebrated by scholars in Europe. But fame did not inflate him recklessly. It changed his access. He began corresponding with leading thinkers. Discussing weather patterns. Ocean currents. Population growth. Public health. His curiosity expanded beyond electricity. He studied ocean temperatures during Atlantic crossings and charted the Gulf Stream, helping ships travel more efficiently. He investigated causes of colds and ventilation. He designed bifocal glasses to correct his own aging eyesight. Each innovation practical. He was not inventing for glory. He was solving problems. And here is what makes this phase profound. Franklin did not retreat into science alone. He integrated it with civic responsibility. He helped found what would become the University of Pennsylvania. He supported the creation of a hospital. He expanded public libraries. His philosophy was clear. Knowledge should improve society, not isolate you from it. By his late 40s, Benjamin Franklin was no longer just a printer or scientist. He was something larger. A public figure. Trusted. Respected. Consulted. And inevitably pulled into politics. Because influence attracts responsibility. Tensions between the American colonies and Britain were growing. Taxation disputes. Trade restrictions. Imperial oversight tightening. Franklin was initially loyal to Britain. He saw himself as British. Proudly so. He believed reconciliation was possible. He even traveled to London as a colonial representative to negotiate concerns. For years, he lived in England again, this time not as an abandoned apprentice, but as a diplomat. Respected. Invited into elite circles. Conversing with ministers and intellectuals. But something changed. Gradually. He observed dismissiveness toward colonial grievances. He saw arrogance. He felt condescension. And then came humiliation. In 1774, during a hearing before the Privy Council, Franklin was publicly mocked and insulted while defending colonial rights. He stood silently as officials berated him. Years earlier, humiliation might have provoked anger. Now, it produced resolve. He returned to America no longer seeking reconciliation. He returned convinced independence was necessary. The scientist had become a statesman. The printer had become a revolutionary. But revolution is dangerous. And signing documents that challenge empire carries risk. In the next phase of his life, Franklin would help draft and sign the Declaration of Independence. He would travel to France, not as a scientist, but as a diplomat seeking military alliance. And his charm, reputation, and strategic brilliance would help secure support that changed the outcome of war. But before that transformation unfolds, pause here. From candlemaker's son to international scientist to political negotiator. And yet, the greatest test of his influence was still ahead. Because lightning is easier to predict than revolution. In the next part, you will see how Benjamin Franklin became one of the architects of a new nation. And how an aging philosopher helped win a war without firing a single shot. Before we continue, ask yourself this. If you had achieved global recognition by 40, would you risk it all for political change? Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. Because somewhere tonight, someone is deciding whether to stay comfortable or step into history. By the early 1770s, Benjamin Franklin was no longer just a printer, inventor, or scientist. He was something more complicated. A colonial representative living in London. A respected intellectual moving among elites. A man balancing two worlds. For years, he had believed reconciliation between Britain and the American colonies was possible. He did not begin as a revolutionary. He began as a mediator. He had spent nearly a decade in England representing colonial interests. He attended social gatherings with members of Parliament. He conversed with philosophers. He was admired for his scientific achievements. His lightning rod and electrical experiments had earned him recognition across Europe. In London, he was not treated as a simple tradesman anymore. He was Dr. Franklin. Respected. Invited. He could have remained there comfortably. But beneath polite conversations, tensions were rising. The colonies were frustrated by taxes imposed without representation. The Stamp Act. The Townshend Acts. Restrictions on trade. From Britain's perspective, the colonies were subordinate. From the colonial perspective, they were partners. Franklin attempted diplomacy. He wrote letters. Proposed compromises. Argued that heavy-handed policies would fracture loyalty. But the tone in London shifted. Arrogance crept in. Dismissiveness grew. Colonial complaints were treated as childish defiance. Then came the moment that changed him permanently. In January 1774, Franklin was summoned before the Privy Council in London. The hearing was meant to address leaked letters from Massachusetts officials that had fueled colonial anger. Franklin stood in a grand chamber. Silent. While a British Solicitor General publicly attacked him. Mocked him. Insulted his integrity. Accused him of dishonor. For nearly an hour, he endured humiliation. He did not argue back. He did not defend himself loudly. He stood still. Composed. Observing. Inside, something irreversible shifted. Years earlier, he had learned in London that class rigidity limited ambition. Now he saw something deeper. The British political establishment did not respect colonial dignity. And without respect, partnership cannot survive. He left the chamber not humiliated, but resolved. Within months, he returned to America. Not as a loyal British subject seeking reform, but as a man convinced independence was inevitable. The colonies were already at the edge of open conflict. Shots had been fired at Lexington and Concord. Tension had become war. Franklin was now nearly 70 years old. 70. Most men of that age retire into comfort. Franklin stepped into revolution. He was elected to the Second Continental Congress. And there, in 1776, he joined a small committee tasked with drafting a document that would announce to the world that the colonies were breaking from Britain. He worked alongside Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Jefferson wrote the majority of the text. Franklin edited it. Subtle changes. Refined language. Sharpened phrasing. His experience as a printer and writer mattered here. He understood rhythm. Clarity. Impact. When the Declaration of Independence was signed, Franklin reportedly remarked, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." It was humor, but not entirely. Signing that document was treason in the eyes of Britain. If the revolution failed, execution was possible. Franklin knew risk intimately. But here is where his greatest contribution began. America needed allies. And the most important potential ally was France. Britain's historic rival. Without foreign support, the colonies were unlikely to defeat the most powerful empire on earth. So in late 1776, Franklin was sent to France as a diplomat. He was 70 years old. Crossing the Atlantic again. Not as a young apprentice. Not as a hopeful entrepreneur. But as a representative of rebellion. France greeted him with fascination. He was already famous for his scientific achievements. His electrical experiments had made him known in intellectual circles. But Franklin did something strategically brilliant. He did not attempt to appear aristocratic. He did not dress in elaborate fashion. He wore simple clothing. A fur cap. Plain attire. He presented himself as the embodiment of the American frontier philosopher. Europe romanticized him. To French society, he represented natural wisdom. Practical intelligence. A new world uncorrupted by rigid class. Salons invited him constantly. Women admired him. Philosophers praised him. He navigated it all carefully. He understood image. He allowed France to see him as symbol. And symbols move nations. Behind the scenes, he negotiated relentlessly. He needed military support. Financial backing. Naval power. For years, France hesitated. Supporting America meant open war with Britain. But Franklin was patient. He cultivated relationships. Built trust. Leveraged his reputation. Then came a turning point. The American victory at Saratoga in 1777 proved the colonies had real potential. Franklin seized the moment. In 1778, France formally entered the war as an ally of the United States. It was decisive. French naval support shifted the balance. French funding sustained the army. Without that alliance, the American Revolution likely fails. And Franklin achieved it without commanding troops. Without firing a weapon. Without charging into battle. He fought with persuasion. Patience. Charm. Timing. He remained in France for years. even as his health declined. He suffered from gout, kidney stones, painful ailments. But he continued negotiating. When peace talks began in 1782, Franklin was central. He helped secure terms that recognized American independence. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally ended the war. The United States was real. And Franklin had helped secure it on foreign soil. Pause there. A runaway apprentice. Humiliated in London. Now signing a treaty with Britain as representative of a new nation. But even then, he did not withdraw from public life. He returned to America. Now an elder statesman. Respected across the world. In 1787, at 81 years old, he attended the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. His body was frail. He required assistance to stand. But his presence mattered. When debates grew heated, Franklin urged compromise. He understood something from decades of negotiation. Rigid pride destroys agreements. Compromise sustains them. He supported the final Constitution. Not because it was perfect, but because it was functional. And he knew perfection is the enemy of stability. By the time he died in 1790, over 20,000 people attended his funeral in Philadelphia. An enormous number for the time. He had become something larger than inventor or diplomat. He had become symbol of self-made intellect, of disciplined ambition, of civic responsibility. But here is the deeper truth. None of this was inevitable. At 10 years old, his education ended. At 17, he ran away illegally. At 18, he was abandoned in London. At 40, he risked death experimenting with lightning. At 70, he risked execution signing rebellion. Each stage required decision, not destiny. And in the final part of this story, we will step back from the public achievements and examine the man himself. His flaws. His regrets. His personal contradictions. Because greatness is rarely pure. And Franklin was no exception. Before we move forward, ask yourself this. If you had reached international fame by 40, would you still risk everything for a cause larger than yourself? Tell me where you're watching from. And what time it is right now. Because somewhere tonight, someone is deciding whether to stay comfortable or change history. When Benjamin Franklin returned from France in 1785, he was 80 years old. 80. In the 18th century, that was not simply old. It was extraordinary. Most men of his generation had been buried decades earlier. Wars had been fought. Empires shaken. A nation born. And Franklin had lived long enough to see it happen. But age has a way of stripping titles away. It reduces you from symbol back to man. The hero returns home not to applause, but to pain. Franklin's body was failing. He suffered from severe gout, bladder stones, chronic infections. He often required assistance to move. At times, he was carried in a sedan chair through Philadelphia streets. The once restless mind now housed inside a fragile frame. And yet, his presence still carried weight. He was elected president of Pennsylvania, what we would now call governor. Even in his 80s, people trusted him. Not because he was perfect, but because he was proven. He had failed publicly, recovered publicly, served publicly. That matters. But while the public image remained polished, privately, Franklin was more complex. He was not a saint. He was not a flawless moral philosopher. He had contradictions. Some of them uncomfortable. For years, he owned enslaved people. Though later in life he became a vocal abolitionist and even served as president of an anti-slavery society, his earlier participation in the system remains part of his record. He evolved. But evolution does not erase beginnings. He was also imperfect in family life. His relationship with his son William Franklin is one of the most tragic aspects of his story. William, his illegitimate son whom he had raised and educated, became the royal governor of New Jersey. And when revolution came, William remained loyal to Britain. Father and son stood on opposite sides of war. They corresponded. They argued. Eventually, they broke. The divide became permanent. Franklin chose the revolution. William chose the crown. After the war, reconciliation was attempted. But the relationship never fully healed. Imagine that weight. Helping birth a nation, while losing a son to ideology. History celebrates public victories. It rarely speaks of private fractures. Plus carried that fracture to his grave. He also struggled with something subtler. Reputation. He had carefully cultivated his public persona, the humble philosopher in a fur cap. But he understood image strategically. He once wrote that humility is often useful even when not entirely genuine. He had a sense of humor about himself. He knew he had shaped how people saw him. Was that manipulation? Or intelligence? Perhaps both. He believed in virtue. Tracked it daily. Promoted it publicly. Yet he admitted privately that perfect virtue was impossible. He abandoned his strict daily virtue tracking later in life. Not because he failed, but because he realized something profound. Self-improvement is a journey, not a checklist. And then there was ambition. For all his humility, Franklin was ambitious. He wanted influence. He wanted impact. He wanted to matter. But here is what made his ambition different from many others. He tied it to usefulness. He once wrote that the most satisfying success is success that benefits others. He founded institutions not for applause, but for structure. Libraries. Hospitals. Fire departments. Educational institutions. He believed societies thrive not through heroes, but through systems. That mindset shaped America more than any single invention. As he aged, he reflected often. He wrote his autobiography in fragments across years. Not as vanity, but as instruction. He wanted future generations to understand how deliberate habits shape outcomes. He did not frame his life as destiny. He framed it as choice. At 81, during the Constitutional Convention, he delivered a speech urging compromise among delegates. He was too weak to stand long. So someone else read his words aloud. He warned them against pride. Reminded them that certainty can blind even intelligent men. He admitted that parts of the Constitution might be flawed. But he supported it anyway. Because unity mattered more than ego. That moment may be one of his most underrated contributions. He understood that nations fail not from lack of intelligence, but from lack of cooperation. In his final years, he became president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. He publicly advocated for the end of slavery. He even petitioned Congress to take action against the institution. For a man who had once owned enslaved individuals, this was evolution. Too late for some. Not enough for others. But real nonetheless. His final months were marked by illness. Pain became constant. In April 1790, at 84 years old, Benjamin Franklin died in Philadelphia. 20,000 people attended his funeral. In a city of roughly 30,000. Think about that. Nearly the entire population. He was buried beside his wife Deborah, who had died years earlier while he was abroad. Their marriage had endured distance, conflict, absence. But it had also endured loyalty and partnership. On his gravestone, there is no grand declaration of genius. No mention of lightning. No mention of diplomacy. Just simplicity. Because in the end, titles fade. But influence remains. Now step back. The arc is astonishing. A 15th child in a candlemaker's house. Pulled from school at 10. Beaten as an apprentice. Runaway at 17. Abandoned in London at 18. Self-made businessman. Inventor. Scientist. Diplomat. Revolutionary. Founding father. And flawed human being. His life was not linear. It was iterative. He revised himself constantly. Like a manuscript. Edited habits. Adjusted beliefs. Evolved opinions. The greatest myth about Franklin is that he was a genius from birth. He was not. He was disciplined from youth. There is a difference. Genius is romanticized. Discipline is repeatable. And here is the quiet truth of his life. He did not wait for permission. Not for education. Not for recognition. Not for opportunity. He built structure around himself until momentum became inevitable. Even his mistakes strengthened him. London betrayal hardened his caution. Family fracture deepened his political resolve. Public humiliation strengthened his patience. He was not defined by single events. He was defined by response. And perhaps that is his most important lesson. Not lightning. Not treaties. Not signatures. Response. What do you do when school ends early? Authority humiliates you? Promises collapse? Family disagrees? Age weakens you? Franklin answered each with adaptation. Now consider this carefully. If Benjamin Franklin had stayed in Boston. If he had accepted candle-making quietly. If he had surrendered after London. If he had chosen comfort over revolution. There is no lightning rod. No French alliance. No signature on the Constitution. History shifts. Because individuals choose. And now, the question turns outward. What structures are you building? What habits are you tracking? What humiliation are you allowing to define you? What disappointment are you converting into strength? Because somewhere tonight, someone is 10 years old and told their education is finished. Someone is 17 and feels trapped. Someone is 18 and betrayed. Someone is 70 and wondering if it's too late to matter. Franklin's life answers that. It is never too early to build. It is never too late to evolve. And legacy is not built from perfection. It is built from persistence. Before we close this series, tell me something. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Because somewhere in the world tonight, another restless mind is reading by candlelight. And they may not know it yet. But they are writing the first page of their own history. Benjamin Franklin's story is not just about lightning, revolution, or diplomacy. It is about discipline. It is about adaptation. It is about a boy who refused to let limited beginnings decide his future. From a crowded candlemaker's house to the halls of European royalty. From public humiliation to international respect. From self-education to shaping a nation. Franklin proved something timeless. You do not need perfect circumstances. You need structure, persistence, and the courage to evolve. If this journey inspired you, if it made you think differently about success, failure, or your own potential, then this channel is for you. We tell stories of real lives. Real struggles. Real transformations. Stories that remind us that history is not built by destiny. It is built by decisions. So make sure you subscribe. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep cinematic biography. And before you go, tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? Because somewhere in the world tonight, another mind is preparing to change history. And the next story might just be yours.